A millionaire paid the bill for a poor mother and son in the supermarket. The next day, he unexpectedly caught them placing flowers on his wife's grave. The soft hum of air conditioning filled the cavernous silence of the mansion. Patrick stood by the window, the Arizona sunlight streaming through the spotless panes, outlining his figure in sharp relief. The room behind him, immaculate and untouched, reflected nothing of the man who lived there. Leather furniture gleamed under the light, and the faint scent of polish lingered, a testament to the housekeepers who tended to spaces Patrick rarely entered. The house appeared timeless, with every corner immaculate, yet devoid of vitality. Patrick's gaze drifted outside, watching the world beyond his gate move with a rhythm he no longer felt part of. Children cycled down the street, their laughter faint but persistent. Neighbors watered their lawns, the distant hiss of sprinklers mingling with the chirp of cicadas. The world hummed with connection and purpose, but Patrick felt like an observer, observing it all from behind the thick glass of his solitude. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly. 6 o'clock. Patrick turned away from the window, his movements precise and practiced, as if he were following an unspoken script. He grabbed his keys from the marble counter, the sound of metal against stone echoing briefly. His reflection in the hallway mirror caught his attention. Sharp, angular features, the grey in his beard creeping upward. He lingered for a moment, studying the worn eyes that stared back. Then, without a word, he stepped out. The cemetery lay just beyond the city's edge, where the chaos of Phoenix gave way to stillness. Gravel crunched under Patrick's polished shoes as he walked the familiar path, bouquet in hand. He passed rows of headstones, each marking a life once vibrant, now reduced to a name and a pair of dates. He stopped at the place he had visited nearly every evening for 22 years. Cynthia Wood, it read. Below it, beloved wife. Patrick crouched, brushing a stray leaf off the granite. His hand lingered on the smooth surface, tracing the letters as if they could bring her back. He placed the bouquet, a mix of lilies and lavender, her favorite, against the base of the stone. The colors looked vibrant against the gray, but Patrick's eyes didn't linger on them. Instead, he sat on the small bench nearby, hands resting on his knees, his posture rigid. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint smell of desert sage. Patrick stared at the horizon, where the sun bled into the sky, casting a golden glow over the cemetery. His thoughts wandered, as they always did here. He could still see her, standing in their kitchen, her hair tied loosely back, sunlight catching on her wedding ring. "You forgot the coffee," she had teased, holding up an empty mug. I remembered the sugar, he had countered, a rare smile tugging at his lips. That memory clung to him like a ghost, vivid and fleeting. He clenched his hands, the knuckles whitening. The silence pressed in, but Patrick welcomed it. Here, it was different. It wasn't the empty silence of his home, where the walls seemed to echo with things left unsaid. Here, it felt like she was listening, as if the quiet was a space for her to answer. "I should have known," he murmured, his voice low and rough. The words hung in the air, unanswered. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He didn't specify what he should have known. Perhaps it was everything, perhaps nothing. The drive back to the mansion was uneventful, the city's glow growing brighter as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the house was exactly as he had left it, pristine, cold, and devoid of energy. Patrick removed his jacket, hanging it meticulously in the closet, his movements precise. In the living room, he poured himself a single glass of scotch. The amber liquid caught the light as he swirled it, staring at the way it refracted into the room. He didn't sip it right away, just held it as he sank into the leather armchair near the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and Patrick's eyes scanned them absently. His mind lingered on the cemetery, on the way the sun had cast long shadows across her grave, and the lingering sense of something unresolved. He didn't know what it was, but it tugged at him, a quiet weight he had carried for years. The scotch burned his throat when he finally drank, but the warmth faded quickly, leaving the same void it always did. Patrick set the glass down, resting his head against the chair. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence once more, steady and indifferent. Tomorrow would be the same, a trip to the cemetery, a conversation with the past, and a return to this lifeless mansion. But tonight, as the city slept and Patrick stared into the darkness, something in him shifted. He didn't know it yet, but the world he had carefully kept at bay was about to knock on his door. The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open, releasing a wave of chilled air that momentarily stung Patrick's face. He stepped inside, adjusting to the unnatural brightness that cast an almost sterile glow on the rows of meticulously stacked produce. His footsteps echoed faintly against the polished tiles, each step a deliberate break in the quiet rhythm of his thoughts. Patrick rarely came to the store himself. It wasn't necessity that brought him here, but the need to escape the stifling silence of his home. In the aisles, surrounded by the faint hum of life, he could momentarily blend into the background, a man like any other, pushing a cart and pretending the world wasn't passing him by. He moved without urgency, his eyes scanning the shelves without truly seeing them. He filled his cart sparingly with a box of tea, a loaf of bread, and some fruit. Turning a corner, he paused, waiting for an older woman ahead of him to finish deliberating over jars of spaghetti sauce. She didn't notice him, her focus unwavering. Patrick didn't mind. He wasn't in a hurry. As he approached the checkout lanes, the faint sound of a child's voice caught his attention. The child's voice, unfiltered, curious, and tinged with innocence, was a voice that no longer belonged in his world. "No, Michael," a woman said softly, her tone tired but patient. "We can't get that today. Maybe next time." Patrick's eyes flicked to the source. A young woman stood at the register, her son, no older than 4, clutching a small box of cookies. His dark curls framed a round face filled with determination. Patrick watched as the woman gently pried the box from Michael's hands and placed it back on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted a small pile of coins, her brows furrowed in concentration. That's all I have," she murmured to the cashier, her voice barely audible. The man behind the register glanced at her, then at the total on the screen, his expression neutral but uneasy. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said after a moment, lowering his voice. "It's not enough." The woman exhaled sharply, glancing at Michael, who was now tugging at the hem of her coat, oblivious to her distress. "Can I—" She hesitated, her words faltering. "Can I leave the bread and just take the milk and eggs?" Patrick's chest tightened, the scene unfolding like something from a story he didn't want to admit he recognized. He stepped forward, his presence drawing the woman's startled gaze. "Put it all back in," Patrick said, his voice steady and low as he addressed the cashier. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet with practiced ease. "I'll cover it." The woman's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. "No, you don't have to." "It's fine," Patrick interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He handed the cashier a crisp bill and waited, his gaze fixed on the register as the man rang up the rest of the items. I don't even know how to thank you," the woman said finally, her voice shaky. "I don't know you." Patrick turned to her, his expression calm but unreadable. "You don't need to." Michael, sensing the tension, looked up at Patrick with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a policeman?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence with unguarded simplicity. The question surprised Patrick, causing him to blink. "No," he said, his lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "Just someone who was standing in line." Michael studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding whether this answer satisfied his question. Then, with the quick forgetfulness of a child, he reached for the cookies his mother had placed back in the cart. "Michael," the woman said softly, a warning in her tone. She turned back to Patrick, shifting awkwardly. "Thank you. Really, it's just been a rough month." Outside, the parking lot glowed dimly under streetlights, their orange hue pooling on the asphalt. Patrick was loading his groceries into the trunk of his car when he noticed the woman struggling to balance her bags and her son. "You live far?" he asked, blurting out the words before he had a chance to consider them. She hesitated, adjusting the boy in her arms. "Not far," she said finally. "Just a few blocks." Patrick gestured to his car. "Let me give you a ride." "No, we're fine." Her answer was quick, her voice defensive. She glanced down at Michael, then at the weight of the bags. "Really, it's just a short walk." "It's no trouble," Patrick said, his tone neutral. He opened the passenger door. "It's dark. You shouldn't be walking." For a moment she stood there, indecision flickering across her face. Finally she nodded. "All right, thank you." Michael climbed into the back seat with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child, immediately pressing his hands to the windows to peer out. "Wow, Mama, look at this car. It's so shiny." Patrick started the engine, the low hum filling the silence. He glanced at Michael through the rearview mirror. "You like cars?" Michael grinned. "Uh-huh. Do you have one of those cars that go super fast?" Patrick allowed a small smile to tug at his lips. "No, but it accomplishes the task." The boy giggled, his laughter filling the confined space. Patrick felt a strange warmth at the sound, something unexpected and unfamiliar. He focused on the road, the boy's voice still ringing in his ears. They arrived at a modest apartment complex, its peeling paint and cracked sidewalks a stark contrast to Patrick's pristine mansion. The woman, now visibly weary, unloaded the bags while Michael scampered ahead. "Thank you," she said again, standing by the open car door. "I don't know what I would have done if—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Just thank you." Patrick nodded, watching her retreat toward the building. Michael waved enthusiastically from the entrance. "Bye, mister. Thanks for the ride." Patrick raised a hand in return, his chest tightening unexpectedly. He watched as the two disappeared inside, their figures swallowed by the shadows of the stairwell. As he drove back home, the silence in the car felt heavier than usual. The boy's laughter lingered in his mind, a small, persistent echo. For the first time in years, the emptiness didn't feel quite so complete. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling city of Phoenix, but Patrick scarcely noticed as he navigated the familiar route to the cemetery. The streets were quieter at this hour, the usual bustle subdued as the city stirred awake. He preferred it this way. Less noise, fewer distractions. The radio remained off, and the silence in the car felt more companionable than oppressive today, perhaps a lingering effect of the previous evening's unexpected encounter. Pulling into the gravel lot, Patrick parked beneath a mesquite tree, its branches offering sparse shade. He stepped out, the air already warm, carrying the scent of creosote and distant asphalt. With a bouquet of lilies and lavender cradled in his hand, he walked the worn path among the headstones, each visit tracing the same steps, an unspoken ritual etched into his routine. As he approached Cynthia's grave, he slowed. Someone was there, a figure kneeling beside the headstone. His grip tightened slightly on the flowers. It was the woman from the supermarket, the one with the young boy. He remembered her as Gloria. She held a modest bouquet of daisies, their white petals stark against the muted tones of the cemetery. She hadn't noticed him yet. She bowed her head, her dark hair cascading around her face like a curtain. Patrick hesitated, an unusual uncertainty creeping in. It had always been a solitary place, a sanctuary, only memories shared. Clearing his throat softly, he made his presence known. Gloria looked up sharply, eyes wide. For a moment, neither spoke. The surprise on her face mirrored his own internal confusion. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, rising to her feet. "I didn't mean to intrude." Patrick shook his head. "You're not intruding. I just wasn't expecting anyone." She glanced back at the headstone, then down at the flowers in her hand. "I didn't think anyone would be here this early." He studied her face. There was a fragility there, but also a determination. Up close, something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. "You knew her?" he asked, nodding toward Cynthia's name etched in stone. Gloria nibbled on her lip. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure." Patrick raised an eyebrow. "You're not sure if you knew her?" She exhaled slowly, as if weighing how much to say. "I'm sorry. This might sound strange. I was hoping to find someone named Cynthia Wood. My birth records from the orphanage list my name as Cynthia Wood. I thought, maybe..." Her words trailed off, leaving an unspoken question hanging between them. Patrick felt a subtle shift in the air, a disquieting ripple through his thoughts. "Cynthia Wood was my wife," he said carefully. Gloria's eyes searched his, a mix of hope and apprehension flickering in their depths. "I see," she whispered. "I didn't know she had family." Patrick glanced away, the weight of years pressing against him. "She passed away a long time ago." "I'm sorry," Gloria said softly. She looked down at the daisies, twisting the stems nervously between her fingers. "I didn't mean to stir up any pain." Silence settled over them, filled only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint hum of the city beyond. Patrick's mind raced, piecing together fragments, her presence here, the name she sought, the subtle resemblance that now seemed more pronounced. "You're searching for your mother," he stated, rather than merely asking. Gloria nodded. "Yes. I grew up in an orphanage here in Phoenix. They told me that my mother left me there shortly after I was born. The only information they had was her name." He studied her face. High cheekbones, a certain softness around the eyes. There was something undeniably familiar, an echo of a face he knew intimately. "And you think Cynthia might be her?" "I'm unsure," she answered, her voice barely audible. "But I've been searching for so long. When I found this grave, I thought maybe I could find some answers." Patrick felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of skepticism and something else he couldn't quite identify. The odds seemed slim, and yet the coincidence was too significant to ignore. "It's a common name," he said cautiously. "I understand," Gloria said, lifting her gaze to meet his. "But I don't have much to go on. I just needed to try." He looked at the flowers in his hand, then back at the headstone. His mind was filled with questions, yet he managed to suppress them. "Perhaps there's another way to find out," he suggested. Gloria's expression shifted, a flicker of hope emerging. "What do you mean?" "I have some of Cynthia's personal records and belongings," he said slowly. "Maybe there's something that could help. Medical records, perhaps." She hesitated. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Patrick replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "If there's a chance we can find the answers you're looking for, it's worth exploring." Gloria studied him for a moment, as if gauging his intentions. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you." That means more to me than you know." He offered a slight nod, unsure of what else to say. The situation felt surreal, layers of his past and present intersecting in unexpected ways. "We can meet later this week," he suggested. "At a cafe, perhaps." "That would be good," she agreed. "I'm free most afternoons." "I'll arrange something," Patrick said. He paused, then added, "I'm Patrick, by the way." "Gloria," she replied, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "I assume you were already aware of that." He allowed a brief smile in return. "Perhaps." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the initial tension easing slightly. Gloria glanced back at the headstone, her eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions. "It's strange," she murmured, "standing here, not knowing if she was." Patrick understood the unfinished thought. "We'll find out," he said quietly. She looked back at him, gratitude evident in her gaze. "Thank you," she repeated. As Gloria turned to leave, Patrick watched her walk down the path, the morning light casting a soft glow around her. The resemblance was there, the way she moved, a certain tilt of the head. It stirred something deep within him, a stirring of memories and questions he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He placed his own bouquet beside hers, the flowers mingling at the base of Cynthia's grave. Straightening up, he took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with a newfound weight. An undercurrent of uncertainty replaced the solitude he usually found here. As Patrick left the cemetery, he sensed a shift in the meticulous order of his life. The encounter with Gloria had unlocked a portal to a past he had not anticipated revisiting. As he drove away, the road stretching ahead seemed less familiar, shadows casting new shapes across the path. The sound of the laboratory door clicking shut behind him lingered in Patrick's mind as he sat in his car, the DNA sample kit still sitting on the passenger seat. He stared at the box, his thoughts tangled. Gloria's face, her soft eyes tinged with a mix of hope and hesitation, flashed in his memory. Was it possible? Could Cynthia have had a child he never knew about? The journey home was a hazy blur. Patrick's hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, the Phoenix streets rushing past in a haze of sunlight and asphalt. At home, he set the box on the kitchen counter, where it sat like a foreign object, disrupting the pristine order of his space. The following week felt heavier than the ones that came before. Patrick found himself glancing at his phone for updates from the lab, even though he knew it was too soon. He couldn't help it. The questions simmered silently in his mind, defying dismissal. In the meantime, he couldn't stop watching Gloria. Patrick had invited Gloria and Michael over one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss logistics about the test results, but he found himself observing her instead. She moved through his kitchen with a quiet efficiency, putting together a snack for Michael without asking where things were. The way she reached for plates and rinsed a knife at the sink felt strangely familiar, instinctive, like she belonged in a space she had never seen before. Michael, meanwhile, darted from room to room, his energy a sharp contrast to Patrick's meticulously arranged home. Patrick found himself sitting in his study, listening to the distant sound of Michael's small feet running across the hardwood floors. "Sorry about him," Gloria said, stepping into the doorway. She smiled apologetically. "He's not accustomed to such neat places." Patrick waved it off. "It's fine. He's spirited." "Spirited is one way to put it," Gloria said, crossing her arms with a faint chuckle. Her expression softened as she glanced toward the hallway, where Michael's laughter echoed. "He's all I've got." The weight in her voice caught Patrick's attention. "You're doing well," he said after a pause. "Raising him on your own." Gloria leaned against the doorframe, her smile fading slightly. "Thank you. It's not easy, but it's worth it. He's a decent kid." Patrick gestured to the chair opposite him, and she hesitated before sitting down. There was an unspoken invitation in his posture, and after a moment, she began to speak. "I don't remember much about the orphanage," Gloria said, her voice quiet. "I was too young to understand why I was there. But I do remember watching the older kids leave. Every time someone came to adopt, I'd hope it was my turn. It never was." Patrick said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on her, his fingers interlaced in his lap. "I exited the system at the age of 18, she elaborated. "They handed me a few papers, my birth certificate, what little they knew about my mother. The name Cynthia Wood was on there, but nothing else. There was no mention of her father or any other family members. Just that name." "Why wait until now to look?" Patrick asked, his voice even but not unkind. "I did try," she admitted. "But life happened. I got a job, met Michael's father." Her voice trailed off, and her expression darkened slightly. "Let's just say he wasn't the person I thought he was. By the time I realized, Michael was already here, and it was just us." She shook her head, a faint smile returning. "But I couldn't let it go. The name, Cynthia Wood. I kept thinking that if I could find her, maybe everything would make sense. Maybe I'd finally feel complete." Patrick felt a pang of recognition, though he couldn't place it. The ache in her voice was too familiar, too close to the hollow spaces he had carefully walled off over the years. As Gloria spoke, he studied her mannerisms, the way her hands gestured when she spoke, the thoughtful pauses between her words. There was something there, a faint echo of someone he had loved, but now struggled to understand. Could Cynthia have had a daughter, a secret she never told him? The idea gnawed at him, unraveling the foundation of the life they'd shared. His mind drifted back to the quiet nights they'd spent together, her hand resting on his arm, her laughter echoing in their home. Had there been signs he missed? "Patrick?" Gloria's voice brought him back. She was watching him, her brows knit with concern. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Just thinking." Gloria nodded, a trace of understanding in her expression. "I know this is strange for you. It's strange for me, too." Patrick leaned forward slightly. "We'll have answers soon." She smiled faintly. "Yeah, I just hope they're the right ones." Patrick didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to the hallway, where the soft hum of toys shuffled on the floor had replaced Michael's laughter. For now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the results. Wait for the answers. Wait to understand the truth of what Cynthia had left behind. But in the quiet moments between, he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for what those answers might reveal. The email from the lab came late in the afternoon, its subject line stark and direct. "DNA test, results available." Patrick stared at his screen, the cursor blinking in the stillness of his study. For a long moment, he didn't move, his breath shallow, as if he feared even breathing. Too loudly might disturb the equilibrium he clung to. Finally, he clicked it open. The words blurred at first, but then one line cut through his hesitation, definitive and unyielding. Probability of biological relationship, 99.99%. Patrick leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as he processed the weight of the confirmation. Gloria was Cynthia's daughter. There was no doubt. His fingers clenched the armrests, the tension in his body a futile attempt to hold back the questions now flooding his mind. How could Cynthia have kept this from him? Had there been signs he'd missed? Moments when she had hesitated? Secrets woven into the fabric of their life together? The warmth of her laughter, the way her fingers lingered on his shoulder. Had it all been a veneer, hiding something deeper? Patrick's mind spun with fragmented memories, each one dissected and examined in a desperate search for answers. The room felt stifling, the air too still. Rising abruptly, he left the study, seeking the only place that ever offered him solace. The cemetery was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the rows of headstones. Patrick stood before Cynthia's grave, the freshly trimmed grass brushing against his polished shoes. "What were you thinking?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "How could you?" The words dissolved into the air, swallowed by the stillness around him. He crouched down, his hand brushing against the cold stone. The familiar ache of grief mingled with a new, sharper pain, a betrayal he couldn't reconcile with the woman he'd loved so deeply. Gloria sat at her small kitchen table, the worn wood warm under her fingers, as Michael played with his toys on the floor. She glanced at her phone for the 100th time, checking for any word from Patrick. The silence stretched uncomfortably, her thoughts oscillating between cautious hope and gnawing fear. When the knock came at the door, her heart jumped. She crossed the room quickly, opening it to find Patrick standing there, his face drawn and unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked. Gloria nodded, stepping aside to let him in. She offered him a seat at the table, but he remained standing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Have you ever been as nervous as Gloria is right now? What was the most stressful moment in your life? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And now, we continue this story." "The results," he said after a moment, his voice heavy. "They confirm it. You're Cynthia's daughter." Gloria exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. I see." Patrick's eyes searched her face, as if looking for traces of Cynthia in her features. "I don't know how to process this," he admitted, his voice low. "She never told me. Not a word." Gloria hesitated before speaking. "I don't know what to say. I thought maybe she had her reasons." Patrick let out a sharp breath, his frustration bleeding through. "Reasons? Why is something like this being kept a secret?" "Maybe she didn't know how to tell you," Gloria suggested cautiously. "Or maybe she thought she was protecting you." "From what?" Patrick's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. He ran a hand through his hair, stepping back as if the space between them might offer some clarity. "She didn't have to protect me. We were supposed to be a team." Gloria lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to make things harder." Patrick looked at her then, his expression softening slightly. "This isn't your fault. I don't blame you." Gloria offered a faint smile, though her eyes remained clouded with uncertainty. "I just wanted to know where I came from. This also applies to Michael. He deserves to know." At the sound of his name, Michael looked up from his toys, his wide eyes flicking between the two adults. "Mama, are you sad?" "No, baby," Gloria said quickly, kneeling beside him. She brushed his curls back gently. "Everything's okay." Patrick watched the scene unfold, the tenderness in Gloria's action stirring something inside him. Despite his turmoil, he couldn't deny the quiet strength she exuded, the way she anchored herself for her son's sake. It was a resilience he both admired and envied. "I need some time," Patrick said finally, his voice softer now. "To think about everything." Gloria nodded, her expression understanding. "Take all the time you need." Patrick turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "This doesn't change the fact that you deserve answers," he said, without looking back. "I'll do what I can to help you find them." "Thank you," Gloria said, her voice steady, despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. As the door closed behind him, Patrick stepped into the evening air, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on his chest. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the upheaval within him. However, as he made his way to his car, he couldn't escape the sensation that his once meticulously planned life had now irreversibly changed. In the quiet of the drive home, Patrick replayed the moments he'd shared with Cynthia, searching for the truth hidden in the shadows of their past. While finding the answers might not be simple, he was certain that he could no longer ignore Gloria's presence in his life. Patrick stood on his back patio, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the manicured lawn. He watched as Michael ran across the grass, arms outstretched like airplane wings, his laughter ringing through the quiet neighborhood. It was a sound Patrick hadn't heard in his home for years, unfiltered, innocent, and oddly comforting. Gloria sat on a wrought iron chair nearby, her hands wrapped around a glass of iced tea. She glanced at Patrick hesitantly before speaking. "You didn't have to invite us over, you know." "I wanted to," Patrick replied, his voice even. "It's better than sitting alone with my thoughts." Her lips pressed into a faint smile, though she didn't push the conversation further. Instead, her gaze followed Michael as he paused to inspect a patch of flowers by the edge of the garden. "Careful, Michael," she called. "Don't pull the petals off." "I'm not," the boy shouted back, crouching low. "I'm just looking." Patrick chuckled softly, surprising himself. "He's curious," he said, glancing at Gloria. "That's not a negative thing." "No," Gloria agreed, her smile widening slightly. "But he's also a handful." Patrick studied the boy for a moment. There was something in Michael's energy, his boundless enthusiasm, the way he threw himself into every movement, that stirred a faint memory in Patrick. He'd been like that once, hadn't he? Life and loss had dulled the edges of his excitement before. "He reminds me of someone," Patrick murmured. Gloria turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Who?" "Myself," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "A long time ago." Later, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the yard, Michael found himself captivated by the koi pond near the garden's edge. Patrick crouched beside him, pointing to the orange and white fish that darted just beneath the surface. "Do they have names?" Michael inquired, his nose nearly touching the water. "Not yet," Patrick replied. "You could name them if you'd like." Michael's eyes lit up. "Really?" Patrick nodded. "Why not?" Michael leaned closer, his small face scrunching in concentration. "That one looks like a spot. And the big one. Maybe Goldie." "Spot and Goldie it is," Patrick said, glancing over his shoulder to see Gloria watching them. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression soft but unreadable. "You're simpatico with him," she said, when Patrick rejoined her a moment later. "I'm not sure about that," Patrick replied, his gaze drifting back to Michael. "I've never been around kids much." "You wouldn't know it," Gloria said. Her voice was light, but there was an undertone of gratitude. Patrick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to her, studying her face, the way her eyes lingered on her son, the faint lines of exhaustion around her mouth. "You're doing all right too," he said finally. "Better than all right, actually." Gloria blinked, taken aback by the compliment. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "That means a lot." As the evening wore on, the three of them found themselves seated at the small outdoor table. Patrick had offered to cook, though Gloria insisted on helping. Together, they prepared a simple meal, grilled chicken, a salad, and bread that Michael devoured as soon as it hit the table. Between bites, Michael told Patrick about his favorite cartoons, his latest adventures at the park, and the time he tried to build a rocket ship out of cardboard. Patrick listened, a faint smile playing at his lips. though he occasionally glanced at Gloria, who sat quietly, her gaze flicking between her son and Patrick. Michael yawned, his head nodding against Gloria's arm as the plates cleared and the stars began to emerge. "You can put him down in the guest room," Patrick offered. "Let him rest for a bit before you go." Gloria hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." She disappeared inside with Michael, leaving Patrick alone under the wide Arizona sky. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars as his thoughts wandered. This house had been so silent for so long, empty in ways that went beyond its physical space. But tonight, with Gloria and Michael here, it felt different. It was not exactly full, but it felt less hollow. As Gloria came back, her footsteps softened as she shut the patio door, causing Patrick to glance up. She said with a small smile, "He's out like a light." "Good," Patrick replied. He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome here any time. Both of you." Gloria's expression shifted, surprise flickering in her eyes, before giving way to something warmer. "Thank you, Patrick. That means a lot." They sat in silence for a moment, the faint hum of cicadas filling the air. Patrick's thoughts turned, unbidden, to Cynthia. He wondered what she would have thought of all this, of Gloria, of Michael. Had she ever imagined this moment, or had she kept her secret so well that even she had buried the possibility? The questions gnawed at him still, but tonight, as Gloria sat beside him and Michael slept peacefully inside, they felt a little less urgent. The question wouldn't leave Patrick alone. It whispered in the quiet moments, gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, and lingered in the unspoken spaces between him and Gloria. Why had Cynthia kept Gloria a secret? What was the deep-seated fear that drove her to carry such a heavy burden to her grave? Unable to live with the ambiguity any longer, Patrick made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Arthur Hayes, an old acquaintance and a trusted private investigator. Arthur was known for his discretion and his dogged pursuit of the truth. "Patrick," Arthur greeted when they met at a small cafe the next morning. His voice was gravelly, his handshake firm. "You wouldn't call me if it wasn't important." Patrick nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "I need you to look into Cynthia's past, before her death, specifically. There are things I didn't know about her. I need to gain a deeper understanding of her. Recently, I met Gloria, part of those past mysteries." Arthur opened the folder, scanning the sparse details Patrick had provided. "And Gloria? How does she fit into this?" "She's Cynthia's daughter," Patrick said, the words heavier than he'd expected. "The DNA confirmed it, but I had no idea she existed. Cynthia never told me." Arthur leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You think she was hiding something?" "I don't know," Patrick admitted, "but I need to." 2 weeks passed before Arthur called. The days dragged as Patrick tried to carry on as usual, sharing tentative moments with Gloria and Michael while battling the growing unease in his chest. When Arthur finally asked to meet again, Patrick felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They met at Patrick's home this time, in the study where so many of his thoughts seemed to linger. Arthur's expression as he entered was grim. "You were right," Arthur said, setting a stack of papers on the desk. "There was something she didn't tell you, and it's complicated." Patrick's breath caught, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair. "Go on." Arthur took a deep breath. "During the year you were in Europe, on that extended business trip, Cynthia reconnected with someone from her past, Mason Parker, an old boyfriend." Patrick's chest tightened. He remembered the name vaguely, mentioned once or twice in the early days of their relationship. "Mason?" Arthur nodded. "They had an affair. It wasn't just a fling. It lasted months. Gloria was the result. Patrick experienced a sudden loss of air in the room. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his back to Arthur. "She betrayed me." Arthur hesitated. "It gets worse." Patrick turned, his expression cold. "Worse?" Arthur nodded, his tone cautious. "After Gloria was born, Cynthia sent her to an orphanage. I've pieced together that guilt consumed her. Guilt for betraying you. Guilt for abandoning her daughter. It tore her apart." Patrick spoke in a strained tone. "And then?" Arthur exhaled slowly. "She orchestrated her own death. The car crash. It wasn't an accident." Patrick sank back into his chair, his mind racing. "She killed herself." Arthur nodded. "She thought it was the only way to escape the guilt, to protect you from the truth." Patrick's throat tightened. "And Mason?" Arthur's expression darkened further. "When he found out about Cynthia's death, he rushed to the scene. He was in an accident on the way. He didn't survive." The revelation struck Patrick with a forceful impact, each one more devastating than the previous. He stared at the papers on the desk, the weight of their implications pressing down on him. The woman he'd loved, the life they'd built, it was all a lie, or at least not what he thought it had been. That evening, Patrick sat in the darkened study, the only light coming from the faint glow of the desk lamp. Gloria and Michael were upstairs, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He replayed every memory of Cynthia, searching for signs he might have missed. Was her laughter ever forced? Was her touch uncertain? He thought of Gloria, of Michael. They were innocent in all this, yet they were tied to the pain, to the betrayal that Cynthia had left behind. Patrick's heart ached for Gloria, who had spent her life searching for answers, and for himself, grappling with a truth he wasn't ready to face. As the clock ticked on, Patrick realized one thing. He could either let this revelation destroy him, or he could find a way to move forward. For Gloria, for Michael, and perhaps even for Cynthia, who had carried her secrets to the grave, with the hope of sparing him pain. But the pain was here now, undeniable and unrelenting. The only question was what he would do with it. The sky was overcast as Patrick walked the familiar path to the cemetery. The air carried a faint chill, unusual for Phoenix, as if the universe mirrored the storm inside him. In his hand was a single lily, its white petals a stark contrast against the grey morning. Cynthia's headstone came into view, its polished surface reflecting the muted light. Patrick slowed, his breath catching in his throat. For years, this place had been a sanctuary, a place of quiet remembrance where he spoke to her as though she were still listening. But today, it felt different, heavy, charged. He knelt beside the grave, the lily trembling slightly in his grasp. Placing it gently at the base of the stone, he let his fingers linger on the cool granite. The words carved there felt like a cruel joke now. Beloved wife. "What were you thinking, Cynthia?" he whispered, his voice raw. "What were you doing?" As it always had, the question lingered in the air, unanswered. Patrick's shoulders sagged, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though trying to hold the pieces of himself together. "You betrayed me," he said, louder this time, his tone edged with anger. "You lied to me, Cynthia. You lied." His voice cracked, with the emotion spilling over. "All those years, all those moments when I thought we had everything. Were you laughing at me? Was I some kind of fool to you?" He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the nearby trees, but it did nothing to quell the storm inside him. "You had a child," he continued, his voice softer now, almost disbelieving. "You had a daughter, and you didn't tell me. Why? Did you think I wouldn't have loved her? Did you think I wouldn't have forgiven you?" Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Instead, he let them fall, streaking his face as he stared at the grave, his vision blurring. "Was it guilt, Cynthia?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Is that why you sent her away? Is that why you—" He swallowed hard. "Is that why you killed yourself?" The words tasted bitter on his tongue. He hadn't wanted to believe it, not until Arthur's investigation had made it undeniable. Cynthia's death had been a choice, not an accident. Cynthia had made the decision to leave him behind. The decision to leave Gloria was made. For a long moment, he sat in silence, the wind carrying the faint hum of the city in the distance. His anger ebbed, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. He closed his eyes, his hand still resting on the headstone. "I loved you," he said quietly. "God, I loved you so much. And I thought, I believed you loved me too." The words came slowly now, each one deliberate. "Maybe you did. Maybe you loved me enough to think this was the only way. But it wasn't, Cynthia. It wasn't." Patrick exhaled shakily, his body trembling. "You made mistakes. You hurt me. But I can't hate you for it. I can't hate you because you gave me Gloria." His mind flickered to Gloria's face, the way her eyes mirrored Cynthia's in a way that was both painful and comforting. He thought of Michael's laughter, the way it had filled his silent home. "You gave me them," he said, his voice firmer now. "And that has to mean something. It has to." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the headstone. The cold stone grounded him, anchoring him to the moment. "I forgive you," he murmured. "I don't know how, but I do. I forgive you, Cynthia." The words felt like a release, lifting a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The air seemed lighter, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. He sat back, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "Goodbye," he said softly. "Goodbye, Cynthia." Rising to his feet, Patrick dusted off his hands. The lily remained where he'd placed it, its petals fluttering gently in the breeze. He turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. As he reached the car, Patrick glanced back at the grave one last time. The pain was still there, but it was different now. The pain had become less sharp, resembling a dull ache, as if a wound was starting to heal. Driving away, he thought of Gloria and Michael. There was still so much to navigate, so much to rebuild. But for the first time, Patrick felt a sense of clarity. While the past was unchangeable, it didn't have to dictate the future. And maybe, just maybe, Cynthia had given him the chance to make something beautiful out of the wreckage she'd left behind. The decision came to Patrick quietly, in the stillness of his study. He'd been sitting there for hours, his gaze fixed on the empty fireplace, when the realization crystallized. Gloria and Michael were part of Cynthia's story, and now his. If he truly meant to forgive Cynthia, it had to extend to embracing the family she had left behind. The next morning, Patrick called Gloria. His voice was steady, but carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Could you and Michael come over this evening?" he asked. "There's something I need to talk to you about." Gloria hesitated, her tone cautious. "Of course. Is everything okay?" "It will be," Patrick replied. When Gloria arrived with Michael, the boy darted into the house with the unrestrained excitement Patrick had come to expect from him. Gloria, however, lingered near the door, her expression uncertain. Patrick gestured for her to sit in the living room, the same space where so many of his memories with Cynthia lingered. "I need to tell you something," Patrick began, his hands resting on his knees. "About Cynthia, about her past, and yours." Gloria's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Patrick inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "I asked someone to look into Cynthia's life before her death. There were things I didn't know. Things she never told me." His gaze softened as he continued. "She had an affair, Gloria. Mason Parker. He was your father." Gloria's eyes widened, and she leaned back, processing the words. I don't know what to say." "She loved you, Gloria," Patrick said quickly. "I need you to know that. The decisions she made, they were out of guilt, out of fear. She thought she was protecting me, protecting you. But she carried that pain with her until the end." Gloria's voice was barely audible. "She sent me away." Patrick nodded, his voice steady. "She thought it was the only way. But I think deep down, she hoped you'd find your way back someday." Silence filled the room as Gloria stared at the floor. Michael, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, played quietly in the corner with a small set of toy cars. Finally, Gloria looked up, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I needed to hear it, even if it hurts." Patrick reached out, placing a hand over hers. "I want you to stay, you and Michael, not just for a little while. For good." Gloria's lips parted, her expression shifting from surprise to something warmer. "Patrick, you don't have to—" "I want to," he interrupted gently. "This house has been quiet for too long. I think it's time it became a home again." Her hesitation melted into gratitude. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Patrick said firmly. "But there's one condition." Gloria tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" "You let me be a part of your family. You let me be a father to you and a grandfather to Michael." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Patrick feared she might refuse. But then Gloria smiled, a genuine radiant smile, and nodded. "Okay, Dad," she said, the word tentative but filled with emotion. Patrick's chest tightened, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in years. Michael, sensing the shift, ran over and climbed onto Patrick's lap. "Does that mean we get to live here now?" the boy asked, his wide eyes gleaming with excitement. Patrick ruffled Michael's hair. "That's exactly what it means." The transformation began the next day. Patrick went into the master bedroom, a place he hadn't touched in years, and opened the closet. Cynthia's belongings were still there, her dresses, her jewelry, the small trinkets she'd collected over the years. He ran his fingers along the fabric of her favorite scarf, memories flooding back. Then, with a deep breath, he began packing the items away. It wasn't an act of forgetting, but of moving forward. Each piece he folded and placed into a box felt like shedding a layer of grief that had clung to him for far too long. Gloria joined him after a while, her presence a quiet support. Together, they worked in silence, the shared task bridging the gap between their pasts and their future. By the end of the week, the house felt different. Laughter echoed through its halls, Michael's giggles as he chased Patrick's aging Labrador through the garden, Gloria's soft chuckles as she watched the scene unfold. Signs of life now dotted the once sterile rooms, toys scattered across the living room floor, a child's drawing pinned to the refrigerator, and the faint smell of Gloria's cooking wafting from the kitchen. Patrick stood in the doorway one evening, watching Gloria read to Michael on the couch. The boy's head rested against her shoulder, his eyelids drooping as her soothing voice lulled him to sleep. Patrick stepped inside, taking a seat beside them. Gloria glanced up, offering him a smile that spoke volumes, of gratitude, of trust, and of a bond was no longer fragile, but rather strong and growing. As he rested his hand on Michael's tiny one, Patrick realized that the mansion, once a mausoleum of memories, had become something new. The mansion, once a mausoleum of memories, had transformed into a living, breathing space that fostered love and hope. For the first time, Patrick allowed himself to believe that this too could be his family. The soft melody of a piano filled the living room, each note a delicate echo that lingered in the air. Patrick sat beside Michael on the bench, his large hands guiding the boy's small fingers across the keys. Michael's face lit up with every sound, his excitement palpable. "Like this?" Michael asked, glancing up at Patrick. Patrick nodded, his voice warm. "Exactly like that. Now try it again, but a little slower this time." Michael focused, his tongue poking out as he pressed the keys, a simple tune emerging. Gloria leaned against the doorway, watching with a soft smile as her son beamed with pride. "You're doing great, buddy," Patrick said, ruffling Michael's hair. Michael grinned. "Can we play a song together next time?" "Of course," Patrick replied. "We'll work on it." As Michael slid off the bench and ran toward the garden, his laughter trailing behind him, Gloria stepped into the room. She sat where Michael had been, her expression curious. "You used to play a lot, didn't you?" she asked, nodding toward the piano. Patrick's gaze lingered on the instrument. "I did. My mother taught me when I was about Michael's age. It was one of the few things we shared." Gloria tilted her head. "Why did you stop?" He hesitated, his fingers brushing the keys. "Life got in the way, I suppose. After Cynthia, it just didn't feel right anymore." Gloria placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think it's wonderful that you're sharing it with Michael. He talks about you all the time now, you know. It's always, 'Grandpa this,' and 'Grandpa that.'" Patrick chuckled softly, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar mix of pride and emotion. "Grandpa, huh? I think I could adapt to that." The days blended into a comfortable rhythm. Patrick and Gloria worked together to bring life into the mansion, each change a small step forward. Patrick shared stories from his childhood, adventures with his friends, lessons learned from his father, and the first time he'd ever set foot in a business meeting. Gloria, in turn, pulled Patrick into the present. She encouraged him to try her recipes, introduced him to Michael's favorite cartoons, and dragged him into playful debates about mundane things, like which brand of peanut butter was superior. Their worlds began to merge in ways Patrick hadn't expected, but welcomed. One afternoon, Patrick sat on the porch with Gloria as Michael played in the yard. The sun was warm, casting a golden glow over the garden. Patrick sipped his iced tea, his gaze fixed on the boy who was now so central to his life. "Do you ever think about what she would say if she were here?" Gloria abruptly interrupted the comfortable silence with her question. Patrick turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Cynthia?" Gloria nodded. "Let's talk about all of this." "About us." Patrick was quiet for a moment, the question settling over him. "I think she'd be happy," he said finally. "She'd see what you've built, what you've become, and she'd be proud." Gloria's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You really think so?" Patrick reached out, covering her hand with his. "I know so. Whatever mistakes she made, whatever pain she carried, she loved you. That much is clear to me now." Gloria smiled, her grip tightening on his hand. "Thank you, Dad." Patrick was still taken aback by the word, yet it consistently brought him warmth. He glanced at Michael, who was now examining a line of ants with intense focus. "And I think she'd adore him," he added, nodding toward the boy. Gloria laughed softly. "That's the straightforward part. Everyone adores Michael." That evening, after Michael was asleep, Patrick found himself in the study, a book in his hands. He wasn't reading, though. His mind wandered to all that had happened, the betrayal, the loss, the unexpected gift of Gloria and Michael. He reflected on the lessons he'd learned, the wounds he'd carried for so long. Love wasn't perfect. It was messy, flawed, and sometimes painful. But it was also resilient. It had the ability to reconstruct the damaged elements, incorporating stronger elements into the gaps. As he closed the book and headed to bed, Patrick felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The mansion, once silent and oppressive, was alive now, with laughter, with hope, and with a future he was no longer afraid to embrace. It was impossible to alter the past. But as Patrick glanced down the hallway at the faint light spilling from Gloria's room, he realized the present was enough. And the future, for the first time in decades, looked bright. The cemetery felt different this time. The crisp morning air carried a sense of finality, not of sorrow, but of resolution. Patrick walked the familiar path, the gravel crunching softly under his polished shoes. In his hand, he held a small wooden box, its surface smooth and worn with age. Cynthia's grave came into view, the headstone gleaming faintly in the soft light. Patrick approached it slowly, his heart calm, but heavy with the weight of everything he had carried and now intended to leave behind. He knelt, placing the box carefully at the base of the headstone. For a moment, he stared at it, gathering his thoughts. "Cynthia," he began, his voice steady. "It will probably be a long time before I come back here, not because I don't think of you, but because I need to let you rest." He paused, his gaze softening. "For so long, I held on to the pain, the questions, the anger. I carried them with me every day, thinking it was the only way to keep you close. But I've realized something. Love doesn't need to hurt. It doesn't need to weigh you down." Patrick leaned forward, his hand brushing the cool granite. "Thank you for Gloria," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For Michael, for giving me a chance to find them, even if it wasn't in the way I would have chosen." He reclined on his heels as a gentle breeze tugged at his jacket. "I understand now," he continued. "You were human, just like the rest of us. You made mistakes, and they cost us dearly. But they also brought something beautiful. They brought me a family." Patrick reached out and opened the small wooden box, revealing its contents. A few of Cynthia's cherished mementos, a pressed flower from their wedding, a locket she had worn on special occasions, and a small handwritten note she'd once left for him that simply read, "You are my heart." "These belong to you," he said quietly. "I wanted you to have them, even if only in spirit. They're a reminder of the love we shared, despite everything." Closing the box, Patrick stood, his hand lingering on the headstone one last time. "Goodbye, Cynthia," he said softly. "And thank you for everything." Back at home, the transformation was palpable. The once sterile mansion now bustled with life. Patrick stepped into the garden, where Gloria and Michael were waiting. The boy was chasing a butterfly, his laughter ringing through the air, while Gloria sat on a blanket, sipping lemonade and reading a book. "Hey, Grandpa!" Michael called out, waving enthusiastically. "Come help me catch it." Patrick chuckled, setting down the basket of fresh lemons he'd picked from the tree. "I'm not as fast as you, but I'll try." He joined Michael, his movements slower, but filled with genuine effort. Gloria watched them with a smile, her heart swelling at the sight of the bond they had formed. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, the three of them sat together on the blanket. Patrick reached into his pocket and handed Gloria a small box. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "It's everything I had of Cynthia's," Patrick said. "Her mementos, her memories. I think it's time for you to have them. Gloria opened the box carefully, her fingers brushing over the contents. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at Patrick. Are you sure? He nodded. I've held on to the past for long enough. It's yours now. Your connection to her, in whatever way you want it to be. Gloria smiled, the tears spilling over as she leaned forward and hugged him tightly. Thank you, Dad. Patrick hugged her back, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. When they pulled apart, Michael climbed onto Patrick's lap, settling in with the contented ease of a child who felt completely safe. As the evening deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the world around them fading into the background. The house, once a monument to grief, was now alive with warmth, laughter and love. Patrick looked at Gloria and Michael, his family, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The past had been painful, but it had led to this, a future he hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time in decades, Patrick felt whole. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he knew that Cynthia's love, flawed and human as it was, had given him the greatest gift of all, a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.